Welcome back to our channel, where we uncover the most incredible true stories that will change how you see the world. Dr. Isabella Montoya Santos had spent 42 years of her life studying the intellectual achievements of the Aztec Empire, but she never imagined that the culture she had devoted her career to understanding was actually written in her own DNA. At 68, she was UCLA's most distinguished professor of Mesoamerican studies, the author of 7 books on Aztec medicine and astronomy, and a consultant to museums around the world seeking to understand the sophisticated knowledge systems that had flourished in Mexico before the Spanish conquest. But on a gray February morning in Los Angeles, sitting in the neurologist's office at UCLA Medical Center, Isabella faced a diagnosis that threatened to steal everything she had spent a lifetime learning. The MRI scans showed unmistakable signs of early-stage Alzheimer's disease, with protein plaques beginning to form in the regions of her brain responsible for memory formation and language processing. Dr. Patricia Williams, the neurologist who had conducted the examination, spoke with the careful compassion of someone who had delivered this news many times before. "Dr. Montoya Santos, I'm afraid the cognitive testing and brain imaging confirm what we suspected. You're showing early signs of Alzheimer's disease. Given the progression pattern we're seeing, I estimate you have perhaps 18 months before the symptoms begin to significantly impact your ability to work and live independently." Isabella stared at the brain scans displayed on the computer monitor, her trained eye immediately recognizing the telltale signs of neurodegeneration that she had seen in research papers, but never expected to confront in her own medical images. The irony was almost unbearable. She had spent decades studying a civilization renowned for its sophisticated understanding of the human mind and healing practices, and now her own mind was betraying her in ways that modern medicine seemed powerless to prevent. "Are there any treatments?" Isabella asked, though she already knew the answer from her own research into Alzheimer's therapies. "We can prescribe medications that may slow the progression temporarily," Dr. Williams replied. "But I have to be honest with you, there's no cure, and the available treatments have limited effectiveness. The best thing you can do is get your affairs in order while you still have full cognitive capacity." That evening, Isabella sat in her Santa Monica apartment, surrounded by the artifacts and books that had defined her professional life. Aztec codices lined the walls, their colorful pictographs telling stories of medical knowledge, astronomical observations, and spiritual practices that had been nearly destroyed by Spanish conquistadors 5 centuries earlier. She had dedicated her career to preserving and interpreting this knowledge, but now she faced the prospect of losing her own memories before she could complete the work she considered most important. As she contemplated her diagnosis, Isabella found herself thinking about her grandmother, Esperanza Xochitl, who had died when Isabella was 15, but whose presence still felt vivid in her memory. Esperanza had been a small, dignified woman who spoke Spanish with her family, but sometimes lapsed into words and phrases in what Isabella later learned was Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. When Isabella was very young, Esperanza would tell her stories about their family's heritage, claiming they were descended from Aztec nobility and that their bloodline carried special responsibilities. "Mija," Esperanza would whisper as she braided Isabella's long black hair, "you carry the blood of Moctezuma in your veins. Someday you will understand what that means, what gifts and responsibilities come with such heritage. The old knowledge is not lost. It lives in the blood of those who remember how to listen." Isabella had loved her grandmother's stories as a child, but as she grew older and more academically oriented, she had dismissed them as romantic folklore. When she decided to study Aztec civilization in graduate school, she told herself it was purely intellectual curiosity, not any kind of personal connection to the culture. She had built her entire career on the principle of objective scholarly analysis, maintaining careful distance between her research and any emotional attachment to the subject matter. But now, facing the loss of her memories and her career, Isabella began to wonder if her grandmother's stories might have contained more truth than she had ever allowed herself to consider. She walked to her bedroom and pulled out the wooden chest that had belonged to Esperanza, filled with family photographs, documents, and objects that Isabella had never taken the time to examine closely. Among the contents, she found something that made her heart race: a family genealogy written in Esperanza's careful handwriting, tracing the Montoya lineage back through centuries of Mexican history. The document claimed that their family was directly descended from Moctezuma II, the last Aztec emperor, through a daughter who had survived the Spanish conquest by fleeing to the mountains of central Mexico. At the bottom of the family tree, Esperanza had written a note in a mixture of Spanish and Nahuatl. Para mi nieta Isabella, la última guardiana del conocimiento sagrado. Cuando leg el tiempo de la oscuridad en su mente, debe regresar a la fuente de toda sanación. For my granddaughter Isabella, the last guardian of sacred knowledge, when the time of darkness comes to her mind, she must return to the source of all healing. Isabella's hands trembled as she read the note. Her grandmother had somehow known that she would face a condition affecting her mind, and had left instructions about returning to the source of all healing. At the bottom of the chest, Isabella found one more item: an old photograph showing Esperanza as a young woman, standing beside a man in traditional Aztec ceremonial dress, in front of what appeared to be a pyramid that Isabella didn't recognize from any archaeological site she had studied. On the back of the photograph, someone had written an address in Mexico City and a name: Don Ricardo Tilaclil, Guardián del Conocimiento Ancestral. The next morning, Isabella called her department chair and arranged for immediate medical leave, citing health concerns that required extended treatment in Mexico. She booked a flight to Mexico City, packed a single suitcase with essential belongings and her grandmother's family documents, and left Los Angeles without telling anyone her true destination or purpose. The flight to Mexico City gave Isabella 8 hours to think about what she was doing. From a rational, academic perspective, traveling to Mexico to chase family legends when she should be starting medical treatment for her Alzheimer's was completely irrational. But another part of her, a part that had been growing stronger since her diagnosis, whispered that conventional medicine had nothing to offer her anyway. If she was going to lose her mind to this disease, at least she could spend her remaining clear time exploring the heritage that her grandmother had claimed was so important. Mexico City's Benito Juarez International Airport was chaotic and overwhelming, but Isabella felt an unexpected sense of homecoming as she heard Spanish and Nahuatl being spoken around her, and saw the volcanic mountains that surrounded the valley where the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan had once stood. She took a taxi to the address her grandmother had written on the photograph, which led to a neighborhood called Xochimilco, famous for its floating gardens that were remnants of the agricultural systems the Aztecs had developed centuries earlier. The address corresponded to a modest house on a quiet street lined with jacaranda trees. When Isabella knocked on the wooden door, it was opened by a man who appeared to be in his early 60s, with weathered brown skin, silver-streaked black hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He studied Isabella's face for a long moment before speaking. "Doctora Isabella Montoya Santos," he said in Spanish accented with Nahuatl intonations. "I am Don Ricardo Tilaclil. I have been waiting for you to come home." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Waiting for me? But how could you possibly know I was coming?" Ricardo smiled, the expression transforming his serious face into something warm and welcoming. "Your grandmother Esperanza sent word many years ago that her granddaughter would return when the sickness of forgetting began to cloud her mind. She told me you had become a great scholar of our people's knowledge, but that you would need to remember the wisdom that lives in your blood, not just the facts that live in books." Isabella followed Ricardo into a house that felt like stepping back in time to an era when Spanish colonial architecture coexisted with indigenous traditions. The rooms were filled with objects that Isabella recognized from her academic studies: Aztec calendars, feathered headdresses, obsidian mirrors, and codices that appeared to be original rather than reproductions. But more than the artifacts, she was struck by the sense that this was a living space where ancient traditions were actively practiced rather than simply preserved. "Don Ricardo," Isabella said carefully, My grandmother told me stories about our family heritage, but I never knew how much of it was literally true. The photograph I found shows her with someone who looks like you, standing in front of a pyramid I don't recognize. That photograph was taken at Teotihuacan, but not at the pyramids that tourists visit, Ricardo explained, settling into a chair beside a fireplace where copal incense burned. There are chambers beneath the Pyramid of the Moon that most archaeologists have never discovered, places where the ancient knowledge was hidden when the Spanish came to destroy our libraries and kill our priests. Ricardo went on to explain that he was what the Aztecs had called a Tlamatini, a keeper of wisdom who had been trained from childhood to preserve and transmit the intellectual and spiritual traditions of his people. His family had maintained this role through 5 centuries of cultural suppression, secretly preserving codices, ceremonial objects, and healing knowledge that the outside world believed had been lost forever. Your grandmother was also trained in the ancient ways, Ricardo continued, but when she married your grandfather and moved to the United States, she could no longer practice openly. She made me promise that when her granddaughter came seeking the source of healing, I would guide her to the knowledge that belongs to her by blood and birthright. You keep talking about this knowledge as if it belongs to me specifically, Isabella said. But I'm just a scholar who happens to have Mexican ancestry. I don't know anything about traditional healing or ceremonial practices. Ricardo studied her face with eyes that seemed to see more than surface appearances. Doctora, you have spent 42 years studying Aztec medicine, astronomy, and mathematics from the outside, analyzing our ancestors' achievements as historical artifacts. But the knowledge you seek, the healing that could restore your mind, requires understanding these traditions from the inside, as a participant rather than an observer. That evening, Ricardo took Isabella to meet other members of what he called the Circle, descendants of Aztec noble families who had preserved traditional knowledge through centuries of cultural persecution. They gathered in a ceremonial space behind Ricardo's house, where a small pyramid structure had been built according to ancient architectural principles. Among the circle was a teenage girl named Itzalzochtli, perhaps 16 years old, whose family had maintained the traditions of Aztec astronomy and calendar keeping. When Itzel looked at Isabella, her young face became serious and ancient at the same time. Tia Isabella, Itzel said, using the respectful term for an elder, I have been dreaming about you since I was a child. In my dreams, I see you standing in the chamber of healing beneath the pyramid, reading from the Codex Medicinalis that has been waiting for you. But I also see darkness growing in your mind like storm clouds, and I know there is not much time. Isabella felt tears welling up in her eyes, though she couldn't entirely explain why. The combination of being called Tia by a teenager she had just met, the matter-of-fact way Itzel spoke about prophetic dreams, and the growing sense that she had stumbled into something far more significant than family genealogy created an emotional response that overwhelmed her usual academic detachment. What is this Codex Medicinalis? Isabella asked. Ricardo's expression became solemn. It is the most sacred of all the medical texts that survived the Spanish destruction, a complete manual of healing knowledge that includes treatments for diseases affecting the mind and memory. The codex was hidden in a chamber beneath Teotihuacan when the Spanish began burning our libraries, and it has remained there for 500 years, waiting for someone with the right bloodline and the right need to claim it. Over the following days, Ricardo began preparing Isabella for the ceremony that would allow her to access the hidden codex. The preparation involved fasting, meditation, and learning to work with sacred plants that could expand consciousness and open awareness to dimensions of reality that normal perception couldn't access. The codex exists in multiple realms simultaneously, Ricardo explained, as he guided Isabella through breathing exercises designed to quiet her analytical mind. On the physical level, it's hidden in a chamber beneath the Pyramid of the Moon, but it's also protected by what our ancestors called the Veil of Quetzalcoatl, a barrier of consciousness that prevents it from being found by those who would misuse its knowledge. Isabella found the preparatory practices both challenging and surprisingly familiar. Despite her academic training, she had always been drawn to meditation and contemplative practices, though she had never connected them to her Mexican heritage. Now, as she learned to quiet her mind and open her awareness, she began to experience states of consciousness that revealed entirely new ways of understanding health and illness. During one particularly deep meditation, she found herself experiencing her Alzheimer's not as a random neurological breakdown, but as a disconnection from the ancestral wisdom that should have been flowing through her consciousness. Instead of feeling like a victim of genetic bad luck, she began to sense her condition as part of a larger pattern that included not just her individual brain chemistry, but her relationship to her heritage, her family history, and her life's work. Alzheimer's is not just a medical condition, Ricardo explained when she described this insight to him. For people who carry the blood of the ancient knowledge keepers, it can be a sign that they have become disconnected from the wisdom traditions that should be nourishing their minds. The Codex contains healing methods that work not just on brain chemistry, but on the spiritual and energetic causes of memory loss. After a week of preparation, Ricardo declared that Isabella was ready for the ceremony that would allow her to access the healing codex. The ritual would take place during the new moon, when the barriers between the physical and spiritual dimensions were weakest, and the ancient protective mechanisms were most permeable. The ceremony began at midnight on a moonless October night. Isabella, Ricardo, Itzel, and 3 other members of the circle gathered at Teotihuacan, entering the archaeological site through channels that avoided the tourist areas and security patrols. They made their way to the Pyramid of the Moon, where Ricardo led them to an entrance that Isabella had never seen mentioned in any archaeological literature. Hidden behind a movable stone panel was a narrow passage that led down into the earth beneath the pyramid. The passage was lit by a phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made Isabella feel as if she were traveling between dimensions. The chamber they entered was circular, carved from volcanic rock and filled with a soft golden light that had no visible source. Stone shelves lined the walls, holding dozens of codices and scrolls that appeared to be in perfect condition despite their obvious age. But Isabella's attention was immediately drawn to a single volume that rested on a jade altar in the center of the room. The Codex Medicinalis was bound in jaguar skin covered with intricate pictographs that seemed to move and shift in the golden light. When Isabella approached it, the designs became more vivid, as if responding to her presence. The codex was warm to the touch, and as she opened the cover, brilliant light spilled from the pages, filling the chamber with radiance. What amazed Isabella most was that the codex seemed to be written specifically for her. The pictographs and text appeared in whatever format she needed to understand them, sometimes in Nahuatl with Spanish translations appearing beside the original words, sometimes in modern medical terminology that connected ancient concepts to contemporary neuroscience. The book seemed to be alive, responding to her questions and presenting information in exactly the way she needed to receive it. As she read, Isabella began to understand that the healing knowledge contained in the Codex Medicinalis was far more sophisticated than anything she had encountered in her academic studies of Aztec medicine. The text described the brain not just as a biological organ, but as an interface between individual consciousness and the collective wisdom of ancestors, community, and the natural world. According to the Codex, conditions like Alzheimer's occurred when this interface became blocked or damaged, cutting off the flow of ancestral knowledge that should nourish and maintain cognitive function. The healing protocols described in the text worked to restore these connections, using combinations of plant medicines, consciousness practices, and ceremonial techniques that could literally rewire the brain's relationship to memory and awareness. The Codex provided detailed instructions for preparing specific plant medicines that could stimulate neuroplasticity and promote the growth of new neural connections. It described meditation techniques that could activate dormant areas of the brain and restore communication between regions that had become isolated. Most remarkably, it explained how ceremonial practices could help individuals reconnect with ancestral wisdom that existed beyond personal memory, accessing knowledge that lived in the bloodline itself. Isabella spent hours in the chamber, absorbing knowledge that seemed to rewrite everything she thought she understood about consciousness, memory, and healing. The information felt like it was being downloaded directly into her mind, creating new neural pathways that enhanced rather than replaced her existing knowledge of neuroscience and archaeology. As dawn broke above the pyramid, Isabella emerged from the underground chamber fundamentally changed. The knowledge she had absorbed felt like it was actively healing her brain, creating new connections and clearing away the protein plaques that had been forming in her neural tissue. Over the following days, working with Ricardo and the other members of the circle, Isabella began applying the healing protocols described in the Codex Medicinalis to her own condition. The treatments involved a combination of plant medicines prepared according to ancient recipes, consciousness practices that seemed to activate dormant areas of her brain, and ceremonial work that connected her to the ancestral wisdom that had been preserved in her bloodline. The results were immediately apparent. Within a week, Isabella's cognitive function had improved dramatically. The memory difficulties and mental fog that had been her early Alzheimer's symptoms began to clear. Most remarkably, she found that her understanding of Aztec culture and history had deepened exponentially, as if accessing the codex had activated genetic memories that connected her directly to her ancestors' knowledge. When she had new neurological testing done at a private clinic in Mexico City, the results confused the examining physician. "Señora Montoya Santos," Dr. Eduardo Ramirez said, comparing her new brain scans to the ones she had brought from UCLA. "These images don't make sense. The protein plaques we see in the earlier scans appear to have decreased significantly, and there are signs of new neural growth in areas that typically show degeneration in Alzheimer's patients." Isabella looked at the scans with the trained eye of someone who had spent months researching her condition. The changes were undeniable. Areas of her brain that had shown early signs of Alzheimer's damage now appeared healthy and active. New neural connections had formed in regions responsible for memory, language, and executive function. "Dr. Ramirez," Isabella said carefully, "I've been participating in traditional healing practices that include plant medicines and consciousness work. It's possible that these approaches are having neurological effects that conventional medicine doesn't typically see." When she returned to UCLA 3 months later, Isabella faced the delicate task of explaining her transformation to colleagues who knew nothing about her heritage or her journey to Mexico. She arranged to meet with Dr. Patricia Williams, the neurologist who had originally diagnosed her Alzheimer's, bringing with her the latest brain scans and cognitive test results. Dr. Williams examined the new data with increasing amazement. "Dr. Montoya Santos, I've been treating Alzheimer's patients for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Not only have your symptoms disappeared, but your cognitive function appears to be significantly better than it was before your original diagnosis. Your memory tests are off the charts." "Dr. Williams," Isabella said, choosing her words carefully, "I've been working with traditional Mexican healing practices that take a different approach to neurological conditions. Instead of just trying to slow the progression of symptoms, these methods focus on restoring the brain's natural healing capacity and reconnecting patients with sources of wisdom and memory that exist beyond individual neural networks." Dr. Williams looked skeptical but intrigued. "Isabella, you know I have enormous respect for your academic credentials. If you believe these traditional approaches contributed to your recovery, I'm willing to listen. But we'll need to document everything carefully and see if we can develop protocols that other Alzheimer's patients could benefit from." Over the following months, Isabella began the careful process of introducing Aztec healing methods into academic and medical contexts. She started by documenting her own case in detail, publishing a paper in the Journal of Ethnomedicine that described the traditional healing approaches she had used and the remarkable improvements in her neurological condition. The response from the academic community was mixed. Some colleagues were fascinated by the possibilities and eager to learn more about consciousness-based approaches to treating neurodegenerative diseases. Others were skeptical about any treatment that couldn't be explained through conventional neurological mechanisms. But the undeniable reality of Isabella's recovery gave her credibility that no amount of theoretical argument could have provided. Working with a small team of open-minded researchers, Isabella began developing clinical protocols that integrated Aztec healing methods with standard Alzheimer's treatments. They started with patients who had exhausted conventional options and were facing rapid cognitive decline, people who had nothing to lose by trying approaches that mainstream medicine didn't recognize. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Patients who learned to work with consciousness-based healing techniques showed significant improvements in memory, cognition, and overall brain function. Their families reported that personalities and abilities that had been lost to dementia began to return. Most remarkably, several patients achieved improvements that seemed to reverse years of cognitive decline. Dr. Maria Santos, a neurologist at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center who had been following Isabella's work, contacted her after several of her own patients mentioned learning Aztec healing techniques. Dr. Montoya Santos, I've been treating Alzheimer's patients for 15 years, and what you're describing sounds almost too good to be true. But I have patients who are showing cognitive improvements that I can't explain through any conventional treatment they've received. This conversation led to the discovery that traditional healing methods from around the world shared common principles about how consciousness and memory were related. Indigenous healers from North America, traditional medicine practitioners from Asia, African traditional doctors, and Aboriginal healers from Australia all reported that they were experiencing similar breakthroughs in treating neurodegenerative conditions using consciousness-based approaches. Isabella found herself coordinating with healers and medical professionals around the world who were working to revive and integrate traditional healing wisdom with contemporary neuroscience. The Aztec Healing Center she established in collaboration with Ricardo and Itzel became part of an international network of facilities where people could learn consciousness-based methods for maintaining and restoring cognitive function. As word of Isabella's recovery spread through the medical community, she was invited to speak at conferences around the world about the potential applications of traditional healing knowledge to neurodegenerative diseases. Standing before audiences of neurologists, psychiatrists, and researchers, she found herself serving as a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern science. For too long, Isabella began her keynote address at the International Conference on Alzheimer's Disease. We have approached neurological conditions as if they were purely biological malfunctions that could be treated with pharmaceutical interventions alone. But traditional healing systems like those developed by the Aztecs understood that cognitive function depends not just on brain chemistry, but on our connections to community, heritage, and sources of wisdom that exist beyond individual memory. She went on to describe the healing methods contained in the Aztec Medical Codex, explaining how consciousness-based practices could be integrated with conventional treatments to achieve better outcomes than either approach could accomplish alone. She presented evidence from pilot programs where traditional healing knowledge was being successfully applied to help Alzheimer's patients recover cognitive abilities that conventional medicine considered permanently lost. The breakthrough came when Isabella received funding from the National Institute on Aging to conduct the first large-scale clinical trial testing Aztec healing methods as an adjunct to standard Alzheimer's treatments. The study would involve over 800 patients at 15 medical centers across the United States and Mexico, comparing outcomes for patients who received conventional care alone versus those who participated in consciousness-based healing programs. While the clinical trial was being organized, Isabella faced a personal challenge that would test everything she had learned about the relationship between heritage, healing, and memory. Ricardo Tilaclil, who had become both her teacher and closest friend, was diagnosed with advanced diabetes complications that threatened his eyesight and kidney function. Unlike Isabella's Alzheimer's, which had responded dramatically to Aztec healing methods, Ricardo's diabetes seemed resistant to traditional treatments. The disease had progressed too far for plant medicines and consciousness work to reverse the damage that decades of poor blood sugar control had inflicted on his organs. "Perhaps this is the way my journey ends," Ricardo said quietly as they sat together in his garden, surrounded by the medicinal plants he had tended for decades. I have lived to see the ancient knowledge return to the world through your work. Maybe that was my purpose, and now it's time for the next generation to carry the wisdom forward." Isabella felt tears streaming down her face. "Don't give up, Ricardo. You taught me that healing is always possible when we remember our connection to the ancestors and the natural world. We're going to fight this with everything we know." The battle for Ricardo's health became a mobilization of the entire traditional healing network that had grown around their work. Healers from Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, and other countries with strong indigenous traditions contributed knowledge and energy to treating his condition. Itzel, now 20 and studying to become both a traditional healer and a medical doctor, led a team of young practitioners who represented the future of integrated medicine. For 6 months, they tried every combination of traditional and conventional treatments they could devise. Insulin therapy was supplemented with consciousness-based healing techniques. Ancient herbal protocols were combined with cutting-edge diabetes medications. Energy healing sessions were integrated with dietary interventions designed to stabilize blood sugar while supporting overall health. Ricardo responded better to treatment than conventional medicine would have predicted. His blood sugar levels stabilized, his energy improved, and his relationships with family and community deepened in ways that seemed to contribute to his physical healing. But the damage from years of uncontrolled diabetes proved irreversible. After 8 months of intensive treatment, his kidneys began to fail despite all their efforts. It was Ricardo himself who finally decided to discontinue aggressive medical interventions. "My friends," he said during a gathering of the healing community, "I have come to understand that my illness is teaching us something important about the limits of healing and the importance of accepting mortality with grace. What do you think it's teaching us?" Itzel asked, her young face serious but peaceful. "That healing doesn't always mean preventing death," Ricardo replied. "Sometimes healing means learning to live fully and die consciously, maintaining our connections to community and spirit even as our bodies fail. The most important healing isn't what happens to our physical forms, but what happens to the wisdom and love we pass on to future generations." In his final weeks, Ricardo became a teacher of a different kind of healing, the healing that comes from accepting mortality while maintaining connection to the eternal dimensions of existence. The hospice where he spent his last days became a place where traditional death ceremonies helped him, and his loved ones understand dying as a sacred transition rather than a medical failure. When Ricardo died peacefully on a spring morning with Isabella, Itzel, and dozens of friends surrounding his bed, the grief was profound but not hopeless. His death became a teaching about how the healing work transcends individual lives, continuing through the people who carry forward the knowledge and love that healers share with the world. The memorial service for Ricardo was held at Teotihuacan, in the ceremonial space where Isabella had first accessed the Aztec healing codex. Representatives from indigenous communities throughout the Americas gathered to honor a man who had helped preserve and revive ancient wisdom for the benefit of future generations. During the ceremony, something extraordinary happened that reminded everyone present why their work mattered so deeply. As stories were being shared about Ricardo's life and contributions, an elderly Huichol shaman from western Mexico approached the circle with tears in his eyes. "I came here," the shaman said in Spanish mixed with indigenous words, "because this man's work helped my own community remember healing knowledge that we thought was lost forever. 3 years ago, my grandson was diagnosed with the forgetting sickness that affects young people. We used the methods that Don Ricardo taught us, combining our Huichol plant medicines with the Aztec consciousness practices. My grandson is now healthy and studying to become a traditional healer himself." Similar testimonials continued throughout the day as people spoke about how Ricardo's preservation of Aztec healing knowledge had touched their lives and communities. Families who had learned to support each other through medical crises using traditional methods. Healthcare workers who had integrated consciousness-based approaches into their practice and seen dramatic improvements in patient outcomes. Researchers who had discovered new understanding about the relationship between heritage, community, and cognitive health. By the end of the memorial service, It was clear that Ricardo's death had not diminished the healing movement, but had instead catalyzed its expansion. People left the ceremony with renewed commitment to preserving and sharing traditional healing knowledge, understanding that this work was about something much larger than any individual healer or teacher. 6 months after Ricardo's death, the results of the National Institute on Aging clinical trial were published in the Lancet Neurology, causing a sensation in the medical community. Patients who received conventional Alzheimer's treatment, supplemented with Aztec healing methods, showed a 67% improvement in cognitive function compared to those who received standard care alone. More remarkably, the integrated treatment group experienced significant reversal of symptoms that conventional medicine considered irreversible. Patients who had lost the ability to recognize family members began remembering their loved ones. People who had stopped speaking began communicating again. Individuals who had required full-time care began functioning independently. The economic implications were equally significant. Despite the additional costs of providing traditional healing services, the integrated treatment approach reduced overall healthcare expenses by 42% due to reduced need for institutional care, fewer medical complications, and improved quality of life for both patients and families. Dr. Susan Mitchell, the director of the National Institute on Aging, held a press conference to announce the study results. This research represents a paradigm shift in how we understand and treat Alzheimer's disease, Mitchell declared. Dr. Montoya Santos and her colleagues have demonstrated that traditional healing methods can achieve outcomes that conventional medicine alone cannot provide. The publication of the clinical trial results triggered a transformation in medical education and practice that exceeded Isabella's most optimistic expectations. Medical schools around the world began developing curricula that included training in consciousness-based approaches to neurodegenerative diseases. Stanford University established the first endowed chair in indigenous neuroscience. Harvard Medical School created a department of traditional healing and cognitive health. The Mayo Clinic announced plans for a research institute dedicated to studying how traditional healing methods influence brain function and memory. As Isabella entered her 70s, she found herself serving as an elder stateswoman for a global movement that had fundamentally changed how humanity approached cognitive health and aging. The Aztec healing program at UCLA had become a model replicated at over 30 medical centers across 4 continents. The training protocols she had developed were being used to prepare a new generation of healers who could work skillfully with both ancient wisdom and modern neuroscience. But the work that brought her the greatest satisfaction was mentoring young healers like Itzel, who represented the future of integrated medicine. Itzel had completed her medical training while also becoming a master of traditional Aztec healing practices, capable of working with complex cases that challenged both conventional and traditional approaches to cognitive health. Tia Isabella, Itzel said during one of their regular consultations about challenging cases, I've been having visions about the next phase of our work. The ancestors are showing me healing centers established in communities around the world, each one adapted to the traditional knowledge of its local indigenous culture, but all connected in a global network of consciousness-based medicine. Tell me more about these visions, Isabella encouraged. I see medical schools teaching traditional healing alongside conventional medicine as if they were always meant to be integrated. I see hospitals with ceremonial spaces where patients work with plant medicines and consciousness practices as a normal part of their treatment. I see families learning to support each other through cognitive challenges using knowledge that their great-grandparents carried, but that was nearly lost to cultural suppression. Itzel's visions were proving prophetic. Medical institutions around the world were beginning to establish programs that integrated traditional healing methods with conventional neurological care. The University of Edinburgh announced plans for the first European Center for Indigenous Cognitive Health. The University of São Paulo established a traditional Brazilian healing research institute. Aboriginal healing centers were being developed in partnership with medical schools across Australia. As Isabella's 75th birthday approached, she was invited to address the World Health Assembly about the implications of consciousness-based healing for global approaches to aging and cognitive health. Standing before health ministers and medical leaders from every nation on Earth, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her Alzheimer's diagnosis 7 years earlier. 7 years ago, Isabella began her address, I was facing the loss of my memory, my career, and my identity to a disease that conventional medicine considered incurable. In my desperation, I turned to the traditional healing knowledge that my Aztec ancestors had preserved through centuries of cultural suppression. That decision not only restored my cognitive function, it opened doorways to understanding the relationship between heritage, consciousness, and healing that are transforming medicine around the world. She went on to describe the global network of healing centers, the integration of traditional methods into medical education, the success of consciousness-based approaches to treating neurodegenerative diseases, and the emergence of young healers whose abilities suggested extraordinary possibilities for the future of human cognitive potential. But perhaps most importantly, Isabella concluded, this work has taught us that memory and consciousness are not just individual biological functions. They are expressions of our connections to community, heritage, and the living wisdom of our ancestors. When we learn to heal from this place of understanding, we create the possibility not just for healthier brains, but for healthier communities and cultures that honor the wisdom of all generations. The response to her address was overwhelming, but more meaningful to Isabella were the conversations that followed with health ministers who wanted to understand how traditional healing could be integrated into their national approaches to aging and cognitive health. Standing in her office at UCLA on a warm California evening, surrounded by the Aztec artifacts that had first drawn her to study Mesoamerican civilization, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought her from a terminal diagnosis to the forefront of a movement transforming global healthcare. The Alzheimer's that had seemed like her greatest enemy had become her greatest teacher, leading her to discover not just her ancestral heritage, but her true calling as a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern understanding. At 75, Dr. Isabella Montoya Santos was living proof that life's greatest challenges could become doorways to its most extraordinary gifts. The healing that had begun with her own crisis had rippled outward to touch millions of lives around the world, and the work was accelerating as new generations of healers carried the knowledge forward into an uncertain but promising future. In the distance, the lights of Los Angeles spread across the valley like a constellation, but Isabella's attention was drawn to a small photograph on her desk showing her with Itzel and a group of young healers from around the world who had come to study Aztec healing methods. They represented the future she and Ricardo had worked to create, a world where traditional wisdom and modern medicine worked together to address humanity's greatest challenges. The Alzheimer's that had once threatened to steal her memories had instead led her to discover memories encoded in her DNA, knowledge that had been waiting for centuries to emerge and heal a world that had forgotten the deep connections between consciousness, community, and health. But Isabella's work was about to face its greatest challenge yet. Dr. Victoria Hartman, a powerful neurologist who controlled Alzheimer's research funding at several major pharmaceutical companies, had been quietly building a coalition to challenge the integration of traditional healing methods into mainstream medicine. Hartman had financial ties to drug companies that stood to lose billions if consciousness-based healing reduced dependence on expensive Alzheimer's medications. The attack came in the form of a coordinated media campaign that questioned the safety and scientific validity of Aztec healing methods. Hartman appeared on medical talk shows and news programs, warning that desperate Alzheimer's patients were being misled by unproven treatments that could delay life-saving conventional therapy. Dr. Montoya Santos may have experienced a fortunate placebo response, Hartman declared during a CNN interview, but encouraging other patients to pursue these mystical treatments instead of proven medical interventions is ethically irresponsible and potentially dangerous. The accusations were particularly painful because they threatened not just Isabella's reputation, but the welfare of hundreds of patients who were benefiting from integrated healing approaches. Hartman's campaign also targeted the UCLA program specifically, claiming that the university was putting patients at risk by allowing traditional healers to work alongside medical staff. Dr. Robert Chen, Isabella's department chair at UCLA, called an emergency meeting to address the growing controversy. "Isabella, we're facing unprecedented pressure from the medical board and several major research sponsors," Chen explained, his face creased with worry. "There are calls for a formal investigation into our consciousness-based healing program, and some administrators are questioning whether we should suspend traditional healing services until these concerns are resolved." Isabella felt the weight of responsibility for the hundreds of patients whose cognitive function had been restored through Aztec healing methods. "Dr. Chen, our clinical data shows clearly that patients who participate in traditional healing alongside conventional treatment have significantly better outcomes than those who receive only standard care. We can't abandon these people because of political pressure from pharmaceutical interests. The solution came from an unexpected source, Dr. Maria Gonzalez, a biostatistician at Harvard who had been analyzing data from consciousness-based healing programs around the world, contacted Isabella with evidence that could definitively establish the scientific validity of traditional healing methods. "Dr. Montoya Santos," Gonzalez explained during a video conference call, "I've been conducting meta-analysis of studies on traditional healing approaches from multiple cultures and medical systems. What I'm seeing is so compelling that I believe we could design a massive international study that would meet the highest standards of medical research and end the debate about whether consciousness-based healing has legitimate therapeutic applications. The proposed study would involve over 3,000 Alzheimer's patients at 40 medical centers across 12 countries. Participants would be randomly assigned to receive either conventional treatment alone or conventional treatment, supplemented with traditional healing methods appropriate to their cultural background. The study would track not just cognitive function and disease progression, but quality of life, family functioning, and healthcare costs over a 7-year period. Securing funding for such an ambitious study required building support from unexpected allies. The World Health Organization provided grants because member nations wanted evidence-based protocols for integrating traditional healing into their healthcare systems. The European Union contributed funding because several countries were exploring traditional approaches to their aging population's cognitive health needs. Even the U.S. National Institutes of Health provided substantial support, recognizing that consciousness-based healing represented a promising area for medical innovation. While the international study was being organized, Isabella received news that would test everything she had learned about healing, loss, and the continuation of wisdom traditions. Itzalzochitl, who had become her closest collaborator and spiritual daughter, was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that was attacking her nervous system and threatening her ability to practice traditional healing. The irony was heartbreaking. Itzal, who had spent her young life helping others recover cognitive function and neurological health, was now facing the possibility that her own nervous system would be permanently damaged. Unlike the conditions that had responded so well to Aztec healing methods, Itzal's autoimmune disease seemed to require approaches that integrated traditional healing with cutting-edge immunology. "Maybe this is my test," Itzal said quietly as they sat together in the UCLA healing garden, watching hummingbirds feed among the medicinal plants. "Maybe I'm being called to learn how to bridge traditional healing with modern immunology, just as you bridged traditional healing with neuroscience." Isabella felt tears welling up in her eyes. "We're going to fight this together, Mija. You taught me that healing knowledge evolves through each generation, adapting to new challenges while preserving ancient wisdom. We'll find a way to integrate everything we know with what modern medicine can offer." The treatment of Itzal's condition became a collaboration between traditional healers from across the Americas and cutting-edge medical researchers specializing in autoimmune diseases. Ceremonies and plant medicines were combined with immunosuppressive therapies. Consciousness-based healing practices were integrated with biological treatments designed to modulate immune system function without destroying the body's natural defenses. The approach was more complex than anything they had attempted before, requiring careful coordination between traditional healers who understood energy and consciousness, and medical specialists who understood the molecular mechanisms of autoimmune disease. But the results demonstrated that ancient wisdom and modern medicine could work together to address even the most challenging health conditions. After 18 months of integrated treatment, Itzel's autoimmune markers returned to normal ranges, and her neurological function was completely restored. More importantly, her experience with the disease had deepened her understanding of how traditional healing could be adapted to address contemporary health challenges that the ancestors had never encountered. "Tia Isabella," Itzel said during one of their regular teaching sessions, "this illness taught me that traditional healing isn't a museum piece that we preserve unchanged from the past. It's a living system of knowledge that grows and adapts to serve the healing needs of each generation." Meanwhile, the results of the massive international study were being compiled and analyzed by research teams on multiple continents. The findings were so remarkable that they prompted Dr. Victoria Hartman to quietly withdraw her opposition to consciousness-based healing, recognizing that the evidence was too overwhelming to continue challenging. When the study results were published simultaneously in The Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, and Nature Medicine, they ended any remaining scientific debate about the legitimacy of traditional healing approaches. Patients who received conventional Alzheimer's treatment, supplemented with consciousness-based methods appropriate to their cultural heritage, showed a 78% improvement in cognitive outcomes compared to those who received conventional treatment alone. More significantly, the study demonstrated that the benefits of traditional healing extended beyond individual patients to their families and communities. Caregivers reported dramatically reduced stress and improved quality of life when their loved ones participated in consciousness-based healing programs. Communities that embraced traditional healing approaches showed improvements in social cohesion, intergenerational communication, and collective resilience. The publication of these results triggered a global transformation in how healthcare systems approached aging, cognitive health, and the integration of traditional knowledge with modern medicine. Medical schools on every continent began establishing programs that trained students in both conventional neuroscience and traditional healing methods. Hospitals started incorporating ceremonial spaces, healing gardens, and traditional practitioners into their standard care protocols. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what researchers began calling genetic healing activation among healthcare workers and family members who participated in traditional healing programs. People discovered that exposure to ancestral healing practices could awaken dormant abilities that seemed to be encoded in their DNA, regardless of their specific ethnic background. Dr. Jennifer Liu, a neurologist at Johns Hopkins who had initially been skeptical of consciousness-based healing, described her transformation in a letter to Isabella. "After participating in your training program, I began noticing that I could sense cognitive changes in my patients before they became clinically apparent. My diagnostic accuracy improved dramatically, and I seemed to be able to provide comfort and healing through intention and presence in ways that went beyond anything I had learned in medical school." Similar reports came from healthcare workers around the world who had learned traditional healing methods from various cultural backgrounds. Japanese nurses discovered abilities to work with energy meridians that enhanced their patient care. Brazilian physicians found that incorporating indigenous healing ceremonies into their practice improved outcomes for patients with neurological conditions. African healthcare workers reported that traditional community healing rituals helped address cognitive challenges more effectively than individual therapy alone. This phenomenon led to the establishment of healing aptitude assessment and training programs at major medical centers worldwide. Healthcare professionals could be evaluated for natural healing abilities and provided with appropriate training to develop these capacities in ways that complemented their conventional medical skills. As Isabella entered her late 70s, she found herself serving as an elder stateswoman for a movement that had fundamentally changed how humanity approached cognitive health aging, and the preservation of cultural wisdom. The consciousness-based healing programs she had pioneered were now standard care at over 200 medical centers across 6 continents. The transformation extended beyond healthcare to educational, social, and spiritual institutions. Universities began establishing departments of traditional knowledge studies. Governments created policies to protect and support indigenous healing practices. Religious organizations started incorporating traditional healing ceremonies into their spiritual care programs. Isabella's memoir, Remembering Forward: How Aztec Wisdom Transformed Modern Medicine, became an international bestseller and helped establish consciousness-based healing as a legitimate field of medical practice. But the work that brought her the greatest satisfaction was training the next generation of healers who would carry the integrated approach forward into an uncertain but promising future. "The ancestors are very pleased with what we have accomplished," Itzel told Isabella during one of their regular conversations in the UCLA Healing Garden. "But they want us to know that this is still just the beginning. The real work of healing the collective memory of humanity is just starting." Isabella nodded thoughtfully, feeling both the satisfaction of a life's work well done and the excitement of new possibilities opening ahead. At 78, she had transformed from a scholar studying ancient civilizations to a living bridge between ancestral wisdom and contemporary healing, helping millions of people around the world reconnect with sources of knowledge and healing that lived in their own heritage. The Alzheimer's diagnosis that had once seemed like the end of her story had instead become the beginning of her greatest contribution to humanity. Through her journey from desperation to discovery, from academic detachment to ancestral connection, she had helped prove that the wisdom of the past held keys to healing the challenges of the present and future. Standing in her garden, as the California sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Isabella felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The disease that had threatened to steal her memories had instead led her to recover memories that belonged not just to her individual life, but to the collective heritage of all humanity. At 78, Dr. Isabella Montoya Santos was living proof that life's greatest challenges could become doorways to its most extraordinary gifts, and that the healing wisdom of our ancestors was always available to those who had the courage to remember who they really were and where they truly came from. But Isabella's greatest test was yet to come. As consciousness-based healing gained acceptance in mainstream medicine, a new challenge emerged that would require all the wisdom she had gained and more. Climate change and environmental degradation were creating unprecedented health crises that seemed to overwhelm both traditional and modern healing approaches. The connection between environmental destruction and cognitive health became apparent when Isabella began receiving reports from healing centers around the world about increasing rates of neurological conditions in communities affected by pollution, deforestation, and climate disruption. Young people in areas with severe air pollution were developing early-onset dementia. Indigenous communities whose traditional lands had been destroyed by mining or logging were experiencing epidemics of depression and memory loss. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a public health researcher at the University of São Paulo, contacted Isabella with disturbing data from the Amazon region. Dr. Montoya Santos, "We're seeing cognitive decline in indigenous communities whose healing traditions have been preserved for centuries. The traditional plant medicines that have always been effective for treating memory problems are losing their potency as the rainforest ecosystems are destroyed." The crisis forced Isabella to confront a truth that had been growing in her awareness for years. Individual healing could not be separated from the healing of the larger environment and community. The consciousness-based healing methods that had transformed her own life and revolutionized medicine were revealing their deeper purpose, not just to cure diseases, but to restore the fundamental connections between human consciousness and the living systems of the earth. Working with Itzel and a new generation of healers who understood both traditional wisdom and contemporary environmental science, Isabella began developing what they called ecological healing protocols, approaches that addressed human health challenges by simultaneously working to restore the environmental and social conditions that supported wellness. The first pilot program was established in partnership with the Maasai people of Kenya, whose traditional lands had been severely degraded by drought and unsustainable agricultural practices. The program integrated Aztec consciousness-based healing methods with Maasai traditional medicine and modern ecological restoration techniques. Elder Joseph Sankil, a traditional Maasai healer in his 70s, had been experiencing memory problems that seemed connected to the degradation of the landscape where his people had lived for generations. "When the land is sick, the people are sick," he explained to Isabella through a translator. "Our healing ceremonies require plants and animals that are disappearing. Our young people are forgetting the old ways because the places where we learned them no longer exist." The ecological healing protocol they developed addressed Joseph's cognitive challenges by simultaneously working to restore the grassland ecosystems that supported traditional Maasai medicine. Community members learned conservation practices that regenerated soil health and plant diversity, while participating in consciousness-based healing ceremonies that strengthened their connections to ancestral knowledge. The results were remarkable. As the landscape recovered, Joseph's memory function improved dramatically. Community members reported feeling more connected to their cultural heritage and better able to adapt traditional practices to contemporary challenges. Most significantly, young people who had been leaving for urban areas began returning to participate in the ecological restoration work, seeing it as a meaningful way to honor their heritage while addressing modern environmental crises. The success of the Kenya program led to similar initiatives in ecosystems around the world. In the Pacific Northwest, traditional Native American healing practices were integrated with forest restoration projects that addressed both community trauma and environmental degradation. In the Andes Mountains, Quechua healing ceremonies were combined with high-altitude agriculture restoration that improved both food security and community mental health. Each program was carefully adapted to local cultural and ecological conditions, but all shared common principles about the inseparable connections between human consciousness, community well-being, and environmental health. The work was demonstrating that healing could not be separated from restoration of landscapes, cultures, and relationships that had been damaged by centuries of exploitation and disconnection. As Isabella entered her 80s, she found herself at the center of a movement that was transforming not just medicine, but humanity's understanding of its relationship to the natural world. The ecological healing centers that had grown out of her work were becoming models for addressing the interconnected crises of health, environment, and social justice that characterized the 21st century. The work attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The United Nations invited Isabella to serve on a commission studying the health implications of climate change, recognizing that consciousness-based healing approaches offered unique insights into how communities could maintain resilience in the face of environmental disruption. Corporate leaders began seeking her consultation on how traditional healing principles might inform business practices that supported rather than undermined ecological and social health. Educational institutions wanted to understand how consciousness-based learning could prepare students to address the complex, interconnected challenges they would face in their careers. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what researchers began calling planetary healing consciousness among young people around the world. Children and teenagers who grew up in communities practicing ecological healing methods seemed to possess natural abilities to sense and respond to environmental imbalances, often developing innovative solutions to local ecological challenges. Xochitl Martinez, a 16-year-old student at the UCLA Ecological Healing Program, exemplified this new generation of planet-conscious healers. Born to a Mexican-American family that had rediscovered their indigenous heritage through Isabella's work, Xochitl had grown up learning both traditional healing methods and contemporary environmental science. "Abuela Isabella," Xochitl said during one of their regular mentoring sessions, using the respectful term for elder, I've been having dreams about healing methods that work with the consciousness of plants, animals, and landscapes themselves. The ancestors are showing me that the next phase of healing work requires learning to communicate directly with the intelligence of natural systems. Isabella listened with fascination as Xochitl described her visions of healing centers that functioned as living ecosystems, where the boundaries between human healing spaces and natural habitats disappeared completely. In these visions, patients worked directly with plants and animals as conscious healing partners, and treatment protocols were designed by the intelligence of the ecosystem itself. The ancestors say that this is how healing was practiced in the oldest times, Xochitl continued, before humans forgot that we are part of nature rather than separate from it. They say that remembering this connection is the key to healing not just individual diseases, but the sickness that affects the whole planet. These conversations led to the establishment of what became known as living healing sanctuaries, protected areas where traditional healing practices, ecological restoration, and consciousness-based medicine were integrated in ways that served both human health and ecosystem regeneration. The first sanctuary was established in the mountains of central Mexico, on land that had been degraded by decades of unsustainable farming practices. Working with local indigenous communities, Isabella's team designed a healing center that functioned as a complete ecosystem, with medicinal plants, wildlife habitats, and human healing spaces integrated in ways that supported the health of all species. Patients who came to the sanctuary for treatment found themselves participating in the restoration of the landscape itself. Planting medicinal herbs became a form of therapy that connected people to the healing intelligence of plants. Caring for injured wildlife helped trauma survivors develop empathy and resilience. Learning traditional agricultural practices that regenerated soil health became a way of healing the disconnection from nature that contributed to many modern health problems. The sanctuary attracted visitors from around the world who wanted to experience this new model of healing that addressed individual, community, and planetary health simultaneously. Researchers came to study how consciousness-based healing methods could inform environmental restoration practices. Artists and writers found inspiration in the integration of human creativity with natural processes. As Isabella's 85th birthday approached, she reflected on the extraordinary expansion of the work that had begun with her desperate search for a cure to her own Alzheimer's disease. What had started as a personal healing crisis had grown into a global movement that was transforming how humanity understood health, healing, and its relationship to the natural world. The living healing sanctuaries had become models that were being replicated in bioregions around the world, each one adapted to local ecological and cultural conditions, but all sharing the fundamental understanding that human health could not be separated from the health of the larger living systems of which humans were part. Standing in the central plaza of the Mexican sanctuary on a warm evening in early spring, watching families from around the world participating in traditional ceremonies, while children played among medicinal plants and wildlife habitats, Isabella felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The Alzheimer's diagnosis that had once seemed like the end of her story had instead become the beginning of a transformation that reached far beyond anything she could have imagined. By learning to heal her own disconnection from ancestral wisdom, she had helped catalyze a planetary awakening to the healing knowledge that indigenous peoples had preserved through centuries of cultural suppression. The work was far from complete. Climate change, environmental destruction, and social inequality continued to create health challenges that required ever more sophisticated integration of traditional wisdom with contemporary knowledge. But Isabella was confident that the foundation had been laid for a new understanding of healing that could address these challenges with the depth and comprehensiveness they required. "Abuela Isabella," Xochitl said, joining her in the plaza as the evening ceremony concluded. "The ancestors want you to know that your work has planted seeds that will grow for many generations. The healing consciousness that you helped awaken is now alive in thousands of people around the world, and it will continue to expand long after our individual lives are complete." Isabella smiled, feeling both the satisfaction of a life well lived and the excitement of possibilities that were just beginning to unfold. At 85, she had become not just a healer and teacher, but a midwife for a new era of human consciousness that understood healing as a planetary rather than merely personal responsibility. The memory problems that had once threatened to steal her identity had instead led her to discover an identity that transcended individual biography, her role as a guardian of wisdom that belonged not just to her own heritage, but to the collective inheritance of all humanity. The healing that had begun with her own crisis had grown to encompass the healing of relationships between cultures, between humans and nature, and between the present generation and both the ancestors who had preserved ancient wisdom and the descendants who would carry it forward into an uncertain but promising future. As the stars appeared in the clear mountain sky above the sanctuary, Isabella felt surrounded by the presence of all the healers, teachers, and wisdom keepers who had contributed to this moment. From her grandmother Esperanza, who had preserved family knowledge through decades of exile, to Ricardo, who had guided her to the hidden codex, to Itzel, who had helped her understand that traditional healing was a living system capable of growing and adapting to new challenges. The consciousness-based healing methods that had saved her own mind had proven to be seeds of a much larger transformation, one that was helping humanity remember its fundamental interconnection with all life and develop the wisdom necessary to heal not just individual diseases, but the collective wounds that threatened the health of the entire planet. At 85, Dr. Isabella Montoya Santos stood as living testament to the power of ancestral wisdom to transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human civilization toward greater health, wisdom, and harmony with the natural world that sustained all life. But even as the living healing sanctuaries flourished and consciousness-based medicine gained global acceptance, Isabella faced one final challenge that would test everything she had learned about healing, legacy, and the continuation of wisdom traditions across generations. Her own mortality was approaching, and with it, questions about how the knowledge she carried could be preserved and transmitted to future healers. The challenge became urgent when Isabella began experiencing what she recognized as the natural cognitive changes that accompany advanced age. Unlike the Alzheimer's that had threatened her decades earlier, these changes were not pathological, but represented the normal transition that occurs as consciousness prepares to return to its source. Her memory for recent events became less reliable, though her connection to ancestral wisdom seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Dr. Sarah Chen, the geriatrician who had been monitoring Isabella's health, was amazed by what she observed. "Isabella, your brain scans show changes that are completely different from typical aging patterns. Instead of the cognitive decline we usually see, you're developing new neural connections in areas associated with intuitive perception and nonlinear thinking. It's as if your brain is reorganizing itself to access different types of consciousness." Isabella understood what was happening. The same consciousness-based healing methods that had cured her Alzheimer's were now preparing her for what traditional cultures understood as the sacred transition from physical existence to ancestral wisdom keeper. But this transition raised critical questions about how to transfer the vast knowledge she had accumulated to the next generation of healers. The solution came through Xochitl, who had grown into a remarkable young woman with abilities that seemed to bridge all the different dimensions of consciousness-based healing that Isabella had explored throughout her career. Now 21 and completing advanced degrees in both neuroscience and traditional medicine, Xochitl had become Isabella's primary successor and the bridge between the work that had been accomplished and the work that lay ahead. "Abuela Isabella," Xochitl said during one of their daily walks through the sanctuary, "I've been having dreams about a different kind of healing center, one that exists partly in physical reality and partly in the realm of consciousness itself. The ancestors are showing me that the next phase of this work requires learning to heal not just individual bodies and local ecosystems, but the collective memory and consciousness of humanity itself." Isabella listened with fascination as Xochitl described her visions of healing centers that could address what she called Civilizational trauma. The deep wounds carried in human consciousness from centuries of war, oppression, environmental destruction, and disconnection from natural and spiritual sources of wisdom. The ancestors say that human beings are carrying traumas that go back thousands of years, Xochitl explained. Traumas from the destruction of indigenous cultures, from slavery and genocide, from the loss of connection to the natural world. These traumas are affecting not just individual health, but the ability of human consciousness to perceive solutions to the crises we face as a species. This insight led to the development of what became known as collective healing protocols, approaches that used consciousness-based healing methods to address the historical and intergenerational traumas that affected entire populations and cultures. The work built on everything Isabella had learned about individual and ecological healing, but expanded the scope to encompass the healing of collective human consciousness itself. The first collective healing program was established in partnership with communities in Rwanda that were still working to recover from the genocide of the 1990s. Traditional Rwandan healing practices were integrated with Aztec consciousness-based methods and modern trauma therapy to create approaches that could address the deep wounds carried not just by individual survivors, but by the entire society. Mama Mukamana, an elderly Rwandan healer who had lost most of her family in the genocide, worked closely with Isabella and Xochitl to develop ceremonies that could help entire communities process collective trauma and reconnect with sources of healing wisdom that transcended individual pain. Our people carry wounds that go deeper than personal memory, Mama Mukamana explained through a translator. The healing must address not just what happened to us, but what was lost when our traditional ways of maintaining community harmony were destroyed. We must heal the break in the transmission of wisdom from ancestors to children. The collective healing ceremonies that emerged from this collaboration were unlike anything that had been attempted before. Large groups of people participated in consciousness-expanding rituals that allowed them to connect with ancestral wisdom while simultaneously processing collective traumas. The results were profound. Communities that had been paralyzed by historical pain began to develop innovative solutions to contemporary challenges, and young people who had been disconnected from their heritage began to rediscover traditional knowledge that could guide them in building healthier futures. The success of the Rwanda program led to similar initiatives in other regions affected by historical trauma. In Australia, Aboriginal communities used collective healing protocols to address the ongoing effects of colonization and forced removal from traditional lands. In the Americas, Native communities worked with these methods to heal intergenerational trauma from boarding school experiences and cultural suppression. In Europe, communities addressed collective wounds from centuries of religious wars and ethnic conflicts. Each program was carefully adapted to local cultural contexts and historical experiences, but all shared the understanding that individual healing could not be separated from the healing of the larger social and historical wounds that shaped community consciousness. As word of these successes spread, Isabella found herself invited to address increasingly diverse audiences about the implications of collective healing for addressing global challenges. The World Economic Forum wanted to understand how consciousness-based healing could inform approaches to international conflict resolution. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization sought her guidance on preserving and revitalizing indigenous knowledge systems. Religious leaders from multiple traditions asked for consultation on how traditional healing methods could enhance interfaith dialogue and cooperation. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what researchers began calling evolutionary healing consciousness among young people who had grown up in communities practicing collective healing methods. These individuals seemed to possess natural abilities to perceive and address systemic problems that previous generations had found intractable. Marcus Running Wolf, a 22-year-old Lakota man who had participated in collective healing programs since childhood, exemplified this new form of consciousness. He had developed the ability to sense the historical trauma patterns that underlaid contemporary social problems and to design interventions that addressed root causes rather than just surface symptoms. "Elder Isabella," Marcus said during a gathering of young healers from around the world, "we can see how the traumas of the past are creating the crises of the present. But we can also see how healing these traumas opens pathways to futures that seemed impossible before. The work you started is giving birth to ways of thinking and being that could transform human civilization itself." These conversations led to the establishment of what became known as evolutionary healing institutes, educational programs that prepared young people to work with consciousness-based healing methods at scales ranging from individual therapy to global systems transformation. Students learned not just traditional healing techniques, but how to apply consciousness-based principles to challenges like climate change, economic inequality, and international conflict. The institutes attracted students from around the world who were drawn to approaches that addressed the root causes of contemporary crises rather than just managing their symptoms. Many were children and grandchildren of people who had been healed through Isabella's programs, carrying both genetic and cultural predispositions toward consciousness-based healing approaches. As Isabella entered her late 80s, she found herself serving as an elder advisor to a global network of healing practitioners who were applying the principles she had helped develop to challenges that spanned every aspect of human experience. The work had evolved far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first received her Alzheimer's diagnosis 30 years earlier. The consciousness-based healing methods that had saved her own mind had proven to be keys to transforming human consciousness itself, helping people remember their connections to ancestral wisdom, natural systems, and each other in ways that made possible solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable. Standing in the garden of the original Mexican sanctuary on a warm evening in late spring, surrounded by medicinal plants that had been cultivated by traditional healers for centuries, Isabella felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The disease that had once threatened to steal her memories had instead led her to recover memories that belonged to all of humanity, the knowledge of how to live in harmony with natural systems and how to heal the wounds that separated people from their deepest sources of wisdom and connection. The work would continue long after her individual contribution was complete. Xochitl and the other young healers she had trained were already developing approaches to consciousness-based healing that exceeded anything Isabella's generation had achieved. They understood not just how to heal individual diseases and local ecological problems, but how to address the systemic imbalances that created these problems in the first place. As the stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Isabella felt surrounded by the presence of all the healers, teachers, and wisdom keepers who had contributed to this moment. From the Aztec physicians, who had first developed the consciousness-based healing methods preserved in the Codex, to her grandmother Esperanza, who had maintained family knowledge through decades of cultural suppression, to the contemporary researchers and practitioners who were carrying the work forward into an uncertain but promising future. The healing that had begun with her own crisis had grown to encompass possibilities for healing the deepest wounds carried in human consciousness and creating conditions for unprecedented flourishing of both human and natural communities. At 88, Dr. Isabella Montoya Santos had become more than a healer or teacher. She had become a midwife for a new era of human consciousness that understood healing as both an individual art and a collective responsibility essential for the survival and thriving of all life on Earth.